Just by round of introductions, my name is Wally Leisure. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for the Americas here at Algo. And then leading today's presentation is Eric Bush. So Eric, I'll let you intro yourself.
Hey, Eric Bush, Executive Vice President for Algo. Previously, I was the founder of Demand-Driven Technologies. We merged with Algo in December, and it's been a very exciting last 7 months as we've gotten the wheels turning with our new partners at Algo. So delighted to be with you today.
Awesome. All right, well, let's go ahead and kick it off, Eric.
Good deal. So really appreciate everyone joining today. This is, as Wally mentioned, the second in a 4-part series of webinars, which are accompanied by white papers that are cascading out as we go through the topic here. We're going to talk about what forecast variability looks like. We're going to talk about how we believe the variation and the inaccuracies in forecasts are frankly quite structural and really not going to change that much. And so that has some implications that we'll talk about in the next webinar as to how we can address those in a better way. We're going to show you some analysis. It's a little nerdy, a little bit down into the details, but I think it'll help illustrate the point that we're trying to make around it's not just that the forecasts are inaccurate, but it's also that they change all the time. And that fluctuation on a weekly basis tends to create a lot of noise within a supply chain environment that we think there's better ways to handle. There's some diagnostics, and we'll show you how you could do some analysis to help you get through and get a better understanding of what's happening in your own environment, which can lead you to making some fundamental changes in your operating environment, as we call it, and moving forward to a better place. So again, this is what we call the diagnosis webinar. We're trying to understand the root cause issues. In the first webinar we did, it was kind of a call to action that illustrates that, hey, there's some fundamental challenges. We've not seen inventory turnover rates improve. Why is that happening? What are some of the root cause issues, and how do we really figure out the way to go forward? Today, we're drilling down on the forecasting piece of it itself. The next 2 sessions will get into how you build an operating model that gives you the ability to deal with the inevitable forecast variation and inaccuracies. And then also some considerations in the final one around how do you deploy this across an organization. This is relatively a significant change in the thinking of how to approach supply chain. And so with that, we're going to go back a page. This was the chart that's kind of my reason for existing. This is from the U.S. Federal Reserve. This is my favorite chart. So apologize if you've seen it 27 times before, but they say repetition is the source of all knowledge. This is a view from the U.S. Federal Reserve of inventory turns for U.S. manufacturers over the last 30 years. And you can want to be at the lower part of this chart, not the top. You can see if you go back 30 years ago to the mid-90s, we were turning at about 1.4 times inventory to sales. We're basically at the same place on the right side of the chart here, 30 years later. There's $1 trillion of inventory in U.S. manufacturing, right? And you would think with all the software investment that has happened over that 30-year horizon, that we would have gotten to some better place. We would have seen some tangible and sustainable improvement in our performance, but in reality, we're kind of stuck in the mud. And I think that there's a lot of reasons behind this. We're going to talk about forecasting as being one of them. But we're trying to approach the problem from the standpoint of first principle thinking, meaning let's challenge all of the assumptions that are out there, because maybe we'll find some things that we can improve on, kind of the way I always talk about SpaceX landing the rockets on the tail, and all of a sudden space exploration and the cost of doing so changes dramatically. Maybe we can find ourselves to a better way. I think about this in the context of this. If we could just shave 10% of the inventory out, that would free up $100 billion of working capital, which is a massive amount of money, right? Wally, what would you do if you had $100 billion? What would you do with that money?
I mean, a couple villas in the Italian countryside might no longer be on the market. I don't know, something like that. Maybe a boat.
Maybe a boat. I was thinking the exact same thing. I'd buy us a really nice boat so we can catch some nice fish off the coast of California, there where you live, and have a lot of fun doing that. Something more important, though, than collecting dust, right? I mean, I think that's inarguable. That why do we have this problem? All of this software investment has been basically predicated on one fundamental set of assumptions that I think are really due to have quite a bit of scrutiny and challenge. First, the planning system, MRP, as our good old buddy, assumes that your forecast or your demand order book is accurate, that nothing's going to change. That is the gospel truth. Why do we do this? Well, because we have to go buy some stuff, and then we have to make stuff, and then we have to distribute it to meet the demand. We have to start ahead of time. So if we don't forecast what's going to happen down the road, how do we know what we're doing in the right way? MRP assumes that the forecast is accurate. It assumes that there's not going to be any variation. And also the user's assumption is that this MRP thing is the only way we have to make sure that we'll have the material on time when the demand arrives. And I don't think any of these assumptions are valid. And so the whole idea of this call and this webinar was to look at what actually goes on in forecasting. Because if we understand that better, maybe there's some other strategies that we could follow to get to a better place and challenge these core assumptions of MRP, which I believe are dramatically flawed. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with an automotive supplier. This is a tier 1 supplier. This is data from an actual item that they were producing that goes directly into an automobile, into the automotive assembly plant. I think I was talking about the signal variation and how this is inevitable that this is happening. I mean, it's not even a forecast that a demand planning group is generating. It's a rolling production schedule that's coming to this automotive supplier. And it's a very, very challenging environment to deal with because obviously when you've got a variance between the minimum percent of actual and the max percent of actual, in this case, it was a 116-point swing from low to high versus what their actual demand was. You're not going to be able to tell Ford or Chrysler or whoever it is you're supplying that they got to clean up their forecasts. You're going to have to learn how to accommodate and work with this. And that's kind of the problem statement that we're trying to raise here, is that this is inevitable. It's going to happen to you. And you can kind of try to wish it away and the like, but the reality is that it's going to change. Maybe in some automotive companies, they're going to give you more stability. Maybe in others, it's going to be more noisy, but you have no control over this. So you have to learn how to accommodate that. Now, let's take a look at the retail environment. This happens to be a consumer electronics product. We're showing the information a little different. We've highlighted the 13-week periods coming up to the actual demand. And you can see here, the variance that they've experienced over those periods, on average, has been around 61%. This is at an item level. And some of the forecasting pundits out there will say, well, that's why you don't forecast at item levels, because it's inherently more difficult. And if you get down to item at a store level, it's going to get even more inaccurate. This is at a channel level, meaning a given retailer, this item's selling through a given retailer who have many, many, many stores, right? Now, the argument would be, well, some of the forecast pundits will say, well, that's why you forecast at category level. If we look at the category level, what we're going to see is there still is a 37-point swing. There were, in this product category, about a dozen cohorts that were in the similar category of electronic device. I think this was headsets or something like that. Yes, the range is narrower, but the reality is that there's still a wide range of variance. And the reality as well is that consumers don't come into the Best Buy or the store and they're buying a range of products. They're going to buy whichever headset, whichever TV, whichever phone that they want that suits their preferences and their needs. So there is quite a bit to this that we have to understand and recognize. It's kind of, I hate to use the serenity prayer, but God grant me the serenity to understand and accept what I can't change, the courage to change what I can, but more importantly, the wisdom to know the difference, right? If we take the assumption that this forecast error, this demand book error and variability is a reality, then it points us to start asking the question, shouldn't we change our strategies? In the white paper, we talk about this variation being a structural issue. So much of the time, people talk about, well, our MAPE score, our forecast accuracy score is this or that or the other thing, but they're ignoring the fact that in the weeks leading up to that point of demand, there was a lot of evolution in the forecast. I think it's largely related to the market itself. The market conditions continue to evolve. These are macroeconomic conditions. There's all sorts of competitive threats now in the global markets that we're dealing with. People will talk about the weather. It was hotter or colder, where there's tariffs, you name it. You can go on and on and on and on and on, pointing your finger at all these things that frankly are totally out of your control, but are going to influence the buyer behavior, whether you're in a B2B mode or in a business to consumer mode. Forecast inaccuracy propagates, meaning the same issues that we're having in that automotive company trying to deal with this signal fluctuation are going to propagate upstream to our suppliers and their suppliers. And so it's called the Bullwhip effect in planning. It's alive and well. There's not a lot we can do about it. We'll talk about, when we get into the next webinar, tactics that you can deploy to help gain more control over that environment. Aggregation, we just looked at the category level forecast. Yeah, it looks more accurate, but the reality is we sell items. When I'm buying if I go to the store and I'm trying to buy a carton of Coca-Cola, I'm not buying, there's a specific size that I want that fits in my fridge the way I like it at my home, blah, blah, blah. That's the reality, is we're not dealing in categories, we're buying at the item level. Sometimes there may be substitution between two items, but more often than not, the buyer has a preference, and the more accurately we can meet that preference, the better off we're going to be. And then finally, human intervention. Everyone in the forecasting centric world feels that they will stop at nothing to try to make that forecast more accurate. But what if there was a way that you could attenuate and reduce that amount of frenzy? Because if there's other ways to ensure the inventory will be available, then we don't need to get so maniacally focused on forecast accuracy. We should look more at what we call our operating model as a technique to override that. So when we have all this fluctuation, Wally, just share your perspective. You came out of industry, you've got your own scar tissue from this. Just talk about what happens when the forecast continues to evolve as we've just described.
Yeah, for sure. So for some of the folks that I've met in the past on the phone, it is always amazing when we talk to customers or prospects and they talk about the buyers and planners come in on a Monday morning, they print out pages and pages of action messages, and then they try to go as far as they can by Friday, and then they need to start over again the following Monday. When Eric talks about and shows that great chart, and these are actuals, these are anonymized actuals. It's amazing when you see that variation. And if you can imagine what that's driving through your supply chain teams, your buyers and your planners, right? Not only do I have the plant manager yelling at me because I'm out of something that I didn't know about. But then I'm also supposed to be expediting something that just changed, as soon as I turned around. So I'm sure folks on the phone are very, very familiar. And then you only do that for a couple months as a buyer or a planner sitting in that seat. And then inadvertently, you are going to create your own messaging. You're going to create your own Excel file. Maybe you've got a buddy in another department that can put together some pretty cool pivots for you and try to get some formulas going. It is a very, very vicious cycle, and we see it time and time and time again. Hang on one second, Eric. You got muted there.
Am I not muted now?
There you go.
There we go. All right. So, and this propagates, and I think everybody has their own anecdotes and stories that they can tell. We rerun the MRP. It generates a new production plan, a new supplier release. The suppliers get angry. Well, I'm going to ship you what I had planned from last week anyway. And it results in all of this turmoil. And there's got to be a better way to get around that. Too much expediting, too much excess inventory, and a lot of user frustration along the way. So the offer that we have here is there's a way you can analyze this. Obviously, there's a critical dependency here that you're archiving your forecasts or your order book, your demand order book each week over the horizon, so that you can look back and assess in your own way how the signal has changed. It's this signal variation that we're really trying to get a better understanding of. If you're in a good shape where you've got less than 30 points of swing, you're lucky. You're in a very lucky point to have that kind of range. But more often than not, you're going to be higher than that, somewhere in the damaging to structural kind of end of the spectrum here. And the more to the right on this scale that you get, the more critical thinking you need to engage here to really look for a different way to solve the problem. Because it's unlikely you're going to be able to change the trajectory of that forecast ranges and the forecast inaccuracy. You're going to have to find other ways to combat that. And that's part of what we'll talk about in the next workshop, the next webinar, which will be in a few weeks. So I think this is really, really important to have this. If you're not tracking this, I definitely encourage you to get started, because by doing this, you're going to start to understand what's happening in your environment. And you're going to get into a place where you can really start applying some different thinking in terms of how best to get to a better place. Take 50 to 100 SKUs, the ones that are most at the center of gravity for your business, that are kind of at that sweet spot of where the revenue is, the volume is, things like that. Look back over at least a 13-week horizon, and I'd say analyze 13 or more, production weeks or shipping weeks or whatever. Get that waterfall going, socialize it within the organization, and then try to determine what those ranges are as they're illustrated in both the white paper and in this presentation, because it'll give you a sense of where on the map you fall. Are you in kind of that steady running place? If that's the case, God bless you, keep going, you're doing great. If it's more in that kind of middle to upper tiers, then I think you really have to go back to the drawing board and start asking some different questions within your organization as to how are we going to deal with this? Because my point would be, it's very unlikely you're going to forecast your way out of it. It just inherently is not going to be the path to greater success. It's going to be found in different techniques that you can deploy into your organization. What we'll talk about in the next webinar is what we call a demand-driven operating model. The proposition that we made in the first webinar was that demand-driven or pull-based tactics can yield dramatic improvements. We've had client after client after client achieve 20 to 30 to even more percentage reductions in working capital and inventory, while at the same time improving their on-time and full order fill rates, which is a paradigm that most companies, find you either going to do one or the other. You're not going to do both at the same time. How you operate your business, given the landscape that you live in, given the variation in the signals of demand that you get, whether it be from the automotive assembly plant that you're feeding into, or in kind of the more retail business to consumer environment where you're trying to assume what the new sales will be of a new item coming along, you're going to be dealing with variation not only in terms of what the actual result is going to be, but also in the weekly forecast each week as you progress towards that. An operating model that allows you to pace to actual demand changes the paradigm, because at least you're starting replenishment based on true demand. You're not guessing about the future. And from that, you gain a lot of benefits. And we'll talk about that in this next webinar, because if you can build that operating model, then you can divorce yourself from a lot of this frustration that you've been dealing with for so many years. You're going to get better inventory turns. You're going to get better service levels. And you're also going to find yourself in a far more manageable environment. The final webinar in the series will be on the topic of how do you deploy these new concepts into your environment. There's a lot of built-in muscle memory in organizations that has to be addressed as you move into more of a demand-driven operating environment. It's quite effective once you lay out the strategy in the proper way. And in that webinar, we'll talk about some of the tactics you need to deploy to help ensure your team can come along to get to a better place. So we have this idea of roughly right being better than precisely wrong. We have this idea, and we've shown it over and over again, that clients can get to a better result. I'm chasing that $100 billion payday when we can get inventory turns to a much better level, free up that working capital, go buy the boats, maybe buy Krispy Kreme and stick one in my backyard so I've always got fresh donuts when I want them. I don't know, but we'll find other ways to move forward in a better way. And so with that, we're going to stop here and take questions. Seems there are quite a few coming in. So Wally, why don't you kind of throw them at me?
Yeah, for sure, Eric. I'm going to have to go mute back and forth just with the audio stuff that we're having, just FYI. So, or if just so you're aware. But some really great questions coming in here. And so we'll go through here. So this is a great question from Fabio, a little more on kind of the demand planning focus side. But, how can planners tell when a forecast override is helpful when it's just adding more noise? Any comment there? Oh, let me get Eric back here.
Can you hear me now, Wally? There's a concept called forecast value add, which is utilized to measure whether your adjustments are actually improving or decrementing the forecast accuracy. Our demand planning solution supports that. I think it's an incredibly important discipline. It helps kind of gain control of when are we going too far down the path of trying to tweak the forecast to get better and better and better. When you measure that forecast value add, it's going to look at what your baseline forecast accuracy was versus what we'll call it a collaborative forecast, one that humans have intervened on and made adjustments to. And it helps you kind of gain better, ongoing learning, if you will, around where adjustments are helping or actually being counterproductive to what you're trying to accomplish. I'll do the muting on and off, Wally.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, another great question here, kind of back on the demand planning focus, though, is that, from Jeffrey here, many organizations treat point of sale as the gold standard for demand planning, yet excess inventory often results from the bullwhip effect, which you talked about a little earlier. Where do you think planners should place the most trust? Should it be in point of sale? Should it be in the customer forecast level? Or should it be actual order history, and why? I know you're very passionate about this one. Got to unmute. Got to unmute.
Wally, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Point of sale represents actual demand, and it is amazingly effective in that regard. Because we're not sure how to ensure we've got enough inventory on hand, we tend to plan to the forecast instead. If we knew there was a technique that would ensure that we would have adequate stock to meet the actual point of sale demand, then we could let that pull, just like a Kanban loop would operate in a manufacturing environment, drive when the replenishments should come. So I believe the point of sale signal is important. People talk about Internet of Things and other pull-based techniques and having sensors out there. If you can pace that to be the replenishing signal, when do we need to ship more? then the only thing you need to decide is what is the appropriate stocking levels. Too often when we put forecasts into the middle of all that, we create distortions. And it's quite interesting because we were working with a large global consumer products company that had their point of sale data for a certain personal care item. Basically, the trend was almost not a trend. It was pretty much flat consumption every week. People use soap at a certain rate in a given population on a pretty consistent basis, right? Yet then they juxtaposed against that how they were shipping and producing. They were introducing lots of their own variability in the process. So I'm a big fan of point of sale as the consumption signal. I think where you make the difference here in a demand-driven operating model, you come up with better ways of ensuring you've got the stock available so you don't have the lost sale situation.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, a couple more questions here. We've got a really active group in the Q&A box. I appreciate that. I'm going to address a couple just on the fly here. Yes, Eric's white paper is going to be available for you. No problem. We can send it out to you. Everyone that's attending today will go ahead and get a copy of this webinar as well as the white paper that's associated with it. And then as Eric's mentioned with the series that's coming through, there's white paper documentation behind that. I think, so Fabio, you had asked, let's go ahead and go forward. We'll add this one here. So Eric, I think you gave some great examples, right? And those are actual examples that we have seen. But why don't you talk a little bit more about this one when you see this time and time again about, is the forecast override helpful or is it just adding more noise? Any commentary in your experience?
Yeah, I feel like I'm a big believer in the Pareto curve. I'll just be real blunt here. There's 20% of the actions we take drive 80% of the benefit. I've seen environments where there is such a focus on demand planning and we are smarter than the forecast engine was, so we're going to make edits. And we start to get too far down that path and it becomes, in some big companies, it's a whole organizational entity now, which has to justify its own existence. And by, because if I'm a demand planner, well, I'm gonna make adjustments because I'm not gonna trust the forecast. And I think that is a serious area that needs attention. I know of some large companies that we've talked to over the years who basically abandoned what they had put in place because they learned this same lesson, right? That it's kind of over the top. We can scale back and we're not gonna lose a beat, right? We're still gonna be able to service our market at the same rate or whatever. So I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of pragmatism. Are we really gaining a better benefit? And we'll talk about this in the design session on our next webinar. If I can build an operating model that can tolerate a certain amount of fluctuation, then anything I do to try to improve the forecast within that range is a waste of time, which some people may not want to hear, but that in fact is the case. And I think that's the key thing we want to tee up when we have this next conversation is how do we approach it in a different way, right? It's in some ways it's my, connection back to SpaceX. Once you figure out how to land the rocket and you preserved it, now it's just the cost of the fuel to relaunch. I mean, the game has changed. If we can find ways to bring balance to that while ensuring that the stock is available, like we said earlier, lower inventory, but better fill rates. Now we've gotten to ourselves to a much better place. And we actually have a construct around which we can understand how much extra work should we actually spend the time on to get to a better forecast. If it's within that range, then I would argue it's not really going to help us at all.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think so. A couple other great questions here. And something I would add. So I think we got a question here from Shahir. So when you said to take 50 to 100 SKU location combinations by location, you mean stores or a channel? Something that Eric is probably going to talk about here as well is that as part of the Intuiflow Algo offering is we run simulations. It's part of our pre-sale activity. So what we can do is if you're open to it, we would actually take a look at some of your data, conduct some analysis. We do not claim that DDMRP methods are a silver bullet. There are parts of your business, there are channels There's new product introduction where you really don't have a good line of sight on history. You have to try to identify and kind of take some risk that is forecast based. So the great part, however, is that there's lots of flexibility within the platform to address all of those various planning methods. So depending upon what the need is, depending upon how you're planning, depending upon how you want to plan, lots and lots of different flexibility here. Another great question here that I'm going to kick over to Eric. Let me go ahead and throw it on the stage, and then I'll ask it here for you, Eric, real quick. So we've got a woman that recently created a 3-month proof of concept, which is great. Small SKU base, 20 SKUs. What sort of project timing do you tend to see for larger scale transformations?
I've seen it go very fast. We've known to have worked with Coca-Cola Beverages of Africa. We did the first country in about a 2-month cycle. We then helped them with the next 2 countries, and then they rolled out the balance on their own. They were through the entire portfolio in less than a year, going country by country by country, given a lot of local conditions and the like. So I think it depends on the landscape of your environment, but it can go quite quickly. And we'll talk about that in the final webinar around deployment. It's important to understand the lay of the land, the context, the different operating modes that your company may be in, where you are in the make to order versus make to stock spectrum, things like that. So, but trust me, it's, the thing I've always been proud of is that you get tangible and sustainable results, rapid time to value, and it's at the end of the day, an easier system to be working in because it's got much more visible signals and it's decoupling a lot of the noise that we've been talking about on this call.
Excellent.
Welcome. If you could put up that QR code so our audience can get a view, because Wally was talking about the simulation offer that we provide. We can help you gain an assessment of what your, there you go, that's the QR code, of what your environment looks like and how much opportunity for improvement there is. Through this, we actually get your demand history, your item details, and we're able to show you, had you been using like DDMRP over the past year, what would your results have been? How different would inventory look? What would your service levels have been? If you had literally been on autopilot during that time, not adjusting orders, just taking them as they came, the day of the demand, et cetera, through the year. Quite revealing. You get a glimpse of the software as well. And inevitably for us, what ends up coming out of those discussions is we start to learn your environment better, understand why you may have certain challenges here or there and the other way. And that allows us to help you understand where DDMRP can be a great solution for you, where you may need other tactics to address certain business conditions that you run into.
Excellent. I think that looks like I don't see any other questions here. Lots of really good questions. Again, appreciate the patience with the technical difficulties today. But just to kind of expand on Eric's answer there for you, Amy. Yeah, so as we see customers that are going down either the POC route or they're trying to evaluate, hey, if we were to roll this out at scale, what would this look like? The beauty is not to bash ERP and digital transformation projects that take 3 years. But the nice part is that you start to see results relatively quickly, as part of data validation exercises, as part of the analysis that's occurring via autopilot, which is a feature within Intuiflow. Very quickly, areas of issues start to bubble up, start to do some validation with buyers saying, yeah, that's not really the lead time. I didn't have the lead time in the ERP system, which is kind of nice because then you get to immediately address issues that might be driving some pain right now. So I'd be happy to talk to you some more if you're interested. So, all right, as we're rounding out here, Eric, I think that's what we've got from the questions for you.
Well, thank you all for your attendance. I really appreciate your interest in what we're talking about here. The white paper is available, so we'll make sure that any of you that have an interest in going through that, very much appreciate any feedback on that. The next session, as we talked about, is that design discussion. That's actually going to be on, let me find the dates here. Hang on. One last reminder. Sorry. It's not in the deck. Oh, there we go. August 26th. we'll be back on stage with an update. And here's where we'll finally get into giving you an indication of where to go and how to go forward. And we'll talk about some of the inherent fundamental changes that we can make to help you get to a much, much better spot. So with that, we'll say thanks and we wish you all the best, and we hope to be with you on your demand-driven journey.